You're listening to the Shared Security Podcast with Tom Eston and Scott Wright, exploring the trust you put in people, apps, and technology.
Silent Pocket is a proud sponsor of the Shared Security Podcast. Silent Pocket offers a patented Faraday cage product line of phone cases, wallets, and bags that can block all wireless signals, which will make your devices instantly untrackable, unhackable, and undetectable. Use discount code SHAREDSECURITY to receive 15% off of your order. Visit silent-pocket.com to take advantage of this exclusive offer.
Hello and welcome to the Shared Security Podcast, episode 80 for September 5th, 2018. I'm Scott Wright, the Streetwise Security Coach, here with Tom Eston. How are you doing, Tom?
I'm doing great. How are you, Scott?
Not bad, not bad. And we have our special guest today. Maybe you can introduce him.
Yes, I'd like to introduce Mr. Chris Hadnagy. He's the founder and CEO of Social Engineer, Inc., and has over 17 years of experience as a practitioner and researcher in the security field. Chris established the world's first social engineering framework available at social-engineer.org, which is an invaluable repository of information on social engineering for professionals and enthusiasts. Chris also created the first hands-on social engineering training course and certification. More recently, Chris founded the Innocent Lives Foundation, which has the mission to unmask child predators in order to bring them to justice. You may remember the interview we did with Chris on episode 68, where we talked about the great work that this organization is doing. Chris is also the author of 4 books on social engineering, his most recent being Social Engineering, the Science of Human Hacking, which we'll be discussing with Chris on the show today. And if all that wasn't enough, in his free time, he's the host of his own show called the social-engineer.org podcast. Welcome back to the show, Chris.
Thank you. Man, you should make money off of those kind of introductions.
Yeah.
You made me sound way better than I am.
Well, you are quite accomplished, Chris. So the words speak for themselves.
We are loyal followers, and yeah, I'd read your first book long ago, so it's been fun to follow your progress and success.
Thank you, I appreciate that.
Absolutely. So, for anyone listening to this podcast and maybe doesn't know what social engineering is, can you just give our listeners a brief overview and tell us why it's important for all of us to understand social engineering?
Sure. So I kind of use a broad definition. I hear a lot of definitions for social engineering that are things like manipulating a person to blah, blah, blah. But I like to define it as any act that influences a person to take an action that may or may not be in their best interest. And I use a broad definition because I think that we use aspects of social engineering every day in the way that we communicate with our kids, our spouse, our employees, employers, clergy, therapists. All of it involves things like rapport, influence, manipulation, nonverbals. And those things are all aspects of how we communicate and social engineer to other people.
So it's much more than just using it to break into a facility and, as part of like a security assessment. It's actually much broader than that.
It is. Yeah. It's kind of a funny thing because my comprehension of social engineering grew over the years. And that is also the progression on how from the first book to this latest book, it kind of defines that. Where when I first started in the industry, everything I was doing was working. But it was almost like street magic. I didn't understand it. I was like, I just would do these things and tilt my head and smile and use a good pretext and people would let me in the door. And I'm like, well, that's pretty awesome. But now 10 years later, there's a science behind it that makes it duplicatable. And that's where I think social engineering has as an industry, as a career, also as an attack vector from malicious people. That's how it's progressed. It's become very duplicatable and scientific in nature.
Yeah, that's what I was one question I had was I noticed the change in the name from art to science. And that makes a lot of sense now that you explained that. It's really evolved into that just over the last 8 years. It was 2010 that your first book came out.
Yeah.
And I know, Scott, you had read that book. I didn't read that book, but I read your new one. And I definitely appreciate, you calling out some of the differences. And that makes a lot of sense where you're talking about moving from art to science.
Yeah, when in the first book with the art, like I said, everything just kind of worked. And then I started to grow as a company, and I had employees that I hired that weren't natural social engineers. And they would say, okay, Chris, how do you do X? And I give them a task, and I had to start to develop internal training programs to get people that I was hiring to become professional social engineers. And you can't just tell someone, like some kind of Jedi trick, like wave your fingers and they will obey. You have to make it a duplicatable process. And that forced me to sit down and think about the sciences behind all of this and start to analyze how and why they worked, and to look for studies that proved it or disproved it. And that made me separate from some things that I did believe at one point, and now, solidly set in science, say, here's how you could duplicate these things. You could train anyone to be a social engineer.
And I know you specifically talk about communication styles in your book, and you had mentioned something that I was introduced to many years ago, just in the consulting world, which is the DISC method. Why is that important for us to understand just, how we like to be communicated to, but also why is it important that we can identify those communication styles from a social engineering perspective?
Yeah, that's a great question. How many hours do we have? So to take it first from your understanding yourself, there's strengths and weaknesses with every communication style. A D, the strength is that they are very task focused. They can get things done, but they can sometimes be too abrupt. That's the weakness. And I, they'll try anything. They'll jump in the middle of a mix and do anything and make jokes and make everyone laugh. But they also can be very appearing to be very self-centered. And S wants the team to win, so they're very focused on making sure everyone's involved, but they could take a long time to make a decision and get moving. And a C loves details and loves to have lists and loves to have a lot of details, but they can also need a little kick in the pants to get going. So understanding where you are in that spectrum can help you see where your strengths and your weaknesses. So like for me, I'm a very strong D communicator. So my strength is no problem with tasks, no problem taking a challenge, but sometimes I could be so direct, I can turn a target off, right? So I needed to understand that. Now flipping that, understanding how to profile someone else's communication style. Now that means if I want to build rapport, now here's a tongue twister. People like people that are like them, and people like people that like them, right? So if you can comprehend those two things, those two aspects of liking, now if you understand someone's communication profile, I can speak to you the way that you want to be spoken to and also be like you. And that makes you like me. Instant rapport, instant oxytocin. And now we're friends and you want to do what I want you to do more so than if we weren't similar and friendly.
It's something that I think salespeople are trained to do, right?
Yes.
It's a sales tactic.
Yep, it is
the same thing, right?
Absolutely.
Sales tactic, con men, you see these throughout history in all those different areas.
And there are probably a lot of people that sort of intuitively are able to sense, the weaknesses and strengths within themselves and others as well, without knowing the whole model. But what percentage of the population would you say is able to do that?
That's a good question. Without training, I think at times people can kind of tell, oh, that person's really direct, or well, that person jokes a lot. But again, we come back to the art and science. Right. So before training, you may look at a person and go, hey, that person's really jovial. They're always joking. I'm going to joke with them and we'll see if we can build rapport. That's great. But that's the art part of it. The science says, if I know that you're an I, or, I perceive you as a C, let's say, then that means I know that to get you to like me, I'm going to need to give you more detail. I'm going to need to be more task focused and not people focused. I need to not invade your privacy. And now the science says I need to alter my pretext from if you were dealing with an I, right? So if I'm trying to SE Tom, then I'm going to be a little more slap on the back, a little more open joke, a little more in your face, because that will be okay for him, So depending on how you profile a person, should adjust how you apply your pretext.
Cool. So it adds sort of another dimension from what most people think of as sort of intuitive.
I think so.
Cool.
Yeah.
And the other thing I like about the disc too is that we can change that style as our situation changes, right? There's, we could be more of a D in certain instances in our lives or situations, and then maybe more of an I or even a C, right?
So yes and no. Yes, you can alter your style with training. But for example, in my profile, I'm very, very high D. So all the way to the top. My next one down is I. I have 0% S, and then I have a little bit of C. So I would be able to switch between D and I easily. C with a little bit of work, but S is going to be really hard for me to communicate as that. And that has been proven true more times than not, especially under stress. I care very little about your feelings, emotions, and well-being. I care about the task at hand. And my employees will testify to that sad fact. So I could try my hardest to communicate as a C, but I'm probably going to oftentimes fail and slip back into what's comfortable for me. So although what you said is true, you can do with training. We tend to slip back into those comfort zones more easily than not.
Yeah, I think that's a key word, the comfort zone, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and the thing is, we're human. So even though we could be social engineers, when I build rapport with you, if you're my target, and now oxytocin's flowing in your brain, well, it's also flowing in my brain, which means that if I'm feeling good with you, I'm going to feel more comfortable, and I can more easily step out of pretext. Or if I'm nervous and things aren't going right, I can have amygdala hijacking, and I can have a little fear response, and that can create a situation where I slip back into my normal discomfort zone, however I am there. So the emotional content works both ways, and we can't switch it off.
That's cool, because I've done a couple of social engineering and engagements myself early on, and I've sort of gotten away from doing that myself because I found that I was always planning for it and then being afraid something would go wrong.
See, like I said, you're a C.
Exactly. So that was that fear that kind of kept me from being successful as a social engineer, but it's kind of funny.
So what about nonverbal communication? I know that was a big theme in your book, and how to identify different types of body language. I think that's important, just like you mentioned the DISC and understanding communication styles, but I always think about maybe my daughter or my kids and how I try to interpret their body language and what that says about how they're trying to communicate to me. What's your thoughts on body language?
Yeah, so in my second book, I had the one of the greatest privileges of my career, which is writing that book, co-authoring it with Dr. Ekman, who I'm like a fanboy. Anyone can probably tell that I am. And that book delved deep into nonverbals. But I had many people that read it and were fans of the work and came back and said, wow, this is so heavy. There's so much to learn. How do I master this? So in this new book, in the fourth book, I decided to take it back and simplify and say, okay, what is it that we need to understand as a social engineer? Now, we don't need to understand every, what they call action unit in a facial expression and how it moves, but we need to understand three things. First, what is the target's baseline? And then when does it shift from comfort to discomfort? Those are the things that you need to know. And that's it. So understanding what that particular body language means, not important. So if your baseline is I come into the office and you're standing there and you're doing this and your arms are crossed and maybe you frown on your face, a little frown, and you look a little upset, you look a little tense, and now I come up to you. I don't need to understand all that. I need to know that's your baseline. Now I come up to you and I make my pretext and I approach, and your baseline changes. Your arms unfold, your eyebrows go up. Now all I need to know is that your baseline changed from discomfort to comfort. I'm doing a good job. But if your baseline changes to where now you're turning away from me with your arms crossed, I'm doing a bad job because you went from discomfort to more discomfort. So in this book, I tried to explain how you can read baselines and then quickly determine that difference between comfort versus discomfort in all the 7 base emotions, and how to use that as a basis for your pretext. And then pile on top of that how it also affects you, right? If you're smiling, your voice sounds different than if you're frowning. So if you're doing vishing calls and you're on the phone and you're nervous as heck and you're tense, it's going to affect how your voice is. And people will hear that and they may not, go, I think he's showing fear in his voice, but it affects them in that nonverbal radar that they start to feel fear too.
That's a really good point. It's something I learned with just taking basic public speaking classes and things like that of, using your hands to speak, those types of things. Even if you're like, say you're not on a WebEx, you're just on a phone call, they always say that you should, smile when you're speaking and you should, use your hands. And it really comes across on, in any type of communication, especially over the phone. I find that fascinating.
Yeah, I agree 100%. And fascinating.
Oh, yeah. So most of our listeners will probably not become professional social engineers, just to be honest. But what's one piece of advice that you would give them on how to best protect themselves from all the different types of scams and frauds and attacks that are just out there that are leveraging social engineering techniques?
Yeah, so that's a good question because it just happened the other day. An older friend of the family, she's in her upper 60s, maybe entering 70. She calls us and she is frantic because she fell for a scam. She was on her computer and using Microsoft Edge, and a thing came up that said her computer was hacked and had problems, and she needed to call this toll-free number to get help from Microsoft. She called the number. Before you know it, she has a whole bunch of remote softwares installed, and they're downloading things from her computer. Now, I look at that and I say, how did it work? It's easy to say, oh, well, she's old and stupid. That's why it worked. That's not the case. She's not stupid. Okay. Yeah, she's a little older, but she is one of the smartest women I know. So definitely it's not a stupidity issue. It was all on emotion. So attack vectors right now are really working on emotion. Your IRS is calling you, telling you didn't pay taxes, and now there's an arrest warrant for you. Microsoft is telling you there's hackers on your computer. They want to help. They're telling you to do wire transfers because the CEO told you to do it. There's child porn found on your computer. You better call and pay this fine to the FBI. All of these attack vectors are based on strong emotional content. So what I've been telling people is just remember one thing. If your interaction, whether it's email, phone, or in person, makes you feel a strong emotion, before you react, take 30 seconds, step away from the situation and think. But don't react when you feel emotional. That's what the attacker wants. They want you to click that link. They want you to make that phone call. They want you to take that action when you're feeling emotional, because emotion shuts down logic centers. So if something happens and you feel emotional at all, 30 seconds. That's all you need. 30 seconds, thinking through it, walk away from the situation, come back, and then figure out how to proceed from there.
That's good advice really for any, type of situation you might be in where, any kind of emergency or, anything. I remember, my daughter, cutting her finger, with a knife and, everybody freaking out in the house. Right. But if you take a step back and just stop for, like you said, 30 seconds, assess the situation, take your emotions, into account and then address it, you're much better off and you can kind of clear your head a bit.
Yeah. And, there's reasons why we have those emotional responses. And there's some situations where that would not be appropriate, like a burglar in your house. The adrenaline is going to make you have that fight or flight response, which is going to save your life. Taking 30 seconds at that point may not be appropriate. But in a situation like with your daughter, that 30 seconds probably made you rationally assess the situation. And instead of calling the helivac, figure out, okay, this is a small cut. Let's figure it out. Let's wrap it up. Let's get it to the doctor and let's get it taken care of, And when we are overly emotional, that part of our brain called the amygdala triggers fear-based responses, and it shuts down logic centers. And it's actually a hack. It's called a hijack. And when our brain's hijacked, we really lose the ability to think critically. So I tell people all the time, and then to follow that up, let's say you did it and you fail. And you fell for it. Then what my older friend did, that family friend, was genius. Instead of just trying to shut the computer off and hoping nothing bad happened, is she had a question in her mind. Did I do the right thing? And she called me. Well, fortunately, it was only 20 minutes previous that they were in her computer. I had her unplug the computer, turn it off, They called her on the phone and said, "Hey, we lost connection. Please turn the computer back on." I told her to hang up, but don't answer the call. I had her go to her bank and change her passwords and PINs and her account information. That was the thing they were going to go for. And then we cleaned. I had her come back, shut her router off. We turned the computer on over the phone. I helped her erase all the programs they installed, and we were able to take care of the situation with a reasonable measure of success and without her having any loss. So don't be afraid to call somebody and say, "Hey, I think I just screwed up. What do I do?" Because the people that don't are usually the ones who end up suffering long-term effects of an attack.
Great advice. Cool.
Thank you.
That's awesome. So where can our listeners find out more about you and what you're up to?
Well, I mean, that's also a loaded question, because if you're looking for the free stuff that we do, social-engineer.org has the newsletter, the podcast, our framework. Something I'm super excited about is we just released a code of ethics.
I saw that
for social engineers. I had somebody approach, not just one person. I had multiple people approach and say that, partially, I'm not single-handedly taking claim for this, but partially we helped start this industry. And now there's a lot of people hanging the shingle out saying they do SE. We needed a code of ethics to say, how do we do it? And how do we keep our clients happy and feeling safe and secure, even though we have to think like the bad guys, but we're not. So we issued this code of ethics, and we're going to be doing some really cool things with that soon. So that's all on the social-engineer.org site. If you're interested in what we're doing from the corporate end, then at social-engineer.com. We have a great blog there and what we do for work. And if you're interested in a nonprofit, then it's innocentlivesfoundation.org. And there's just some really great things that are happening with the foundation right now. And we did a couple humble bundles. They were kind enough to make us the benefactor for the last couple humble bundles. And we had over $190,000 in donations in the last 4 months, which is just the number is mind-blowing to me.
Wow.
We just started this as an idea, and now there's a couple $100,000 sitting in the account feeding our volunteers, so that way we can keep this thing moving forward. And we are so we have 4 active cases with law enforcement right now, and we're working on at least a dozen other cases right now that will be handed over to law enforcement soon. We've had 5 or 6 people report very personal cases to us through our website. That's the innocentlivesfoundation.org. They can go there and report a case. And we're working with many people on some really sensitive cases, trying to help their kids and help other kids. So there's just a lot of great things, but those are the ways you can find out more stuff about us on the website.
That's great. Amazing.
Yeah, and we did interview Chris on episode 68, which was just on the Innocent Lives Foundation, if you're interested in listening to that for a little more detail. But you're doing great things, and it's good to hear that organization is continuing and it's being successful, because it's very important.
Thank you. Yeah, we have a lot of really great people at DEF CON, both Neil Fallon from Clutch, Tim Maloney, our lawyer, and AJ Cook from Criminal Minds all flew out to DEF CON. And we gave a big joint speech about what we're doing, and that just raised so much awareness in the community, and it was just really great to kind of get everyone together and meet. It was a really great time, and that helped propel us. There was a lot of people in the room who want to help. So I have a stack of business cards sitting here, and we're reaching out to those folks now after we finally recovered from DEF CON.
I was going to ask you, how did the Social Engineering CTF go?
That was great this year. It really was. So we chose the transportation industry, which meant trucking, car rental, airlines. Big industry, for that. And we had a lot of people that were not in the field, right? More noobs than experienced social engineers in the competition this year. And it was just phenomenal. 2 women, first and second place. So that's a first for us too, to have 2 women dominating the competition. That was great. And we upgraded our booth this year to an actual real vocal booth for like rock stars, which
Nice.
gave the people competing a whole new feel, because you're in this giant room. It's got like the foam that's next to you. The whole room is made of that foam on the inside, and it's just really, really great. So it was a pretty cool event, but we had a much larger room this year, and it was constantly packed. We had line for hours out the door. But it was really great year this year.
That's great. Yeah, it's good to hear that it keeps growing every year and just gets bigger. It was kind of cool hearing that Rachel Toback, she came in second place again. I think that's the third year, right?
Yeah, I was so hoping that if she was going to take second, that someone named Chris would have taken first.
Right.
That's her new conspiracy theory, that she always loses to a person named Chris.
Oh, that's funny.
But Whitney Merrill took first place, and she's experienced in the field. She has done some of this work before. She's a pen tester, and it showed. I mean, she really nailed her pretexts, and she had a great report, a lot of OSINT, and did a great job in the booth. And Rachel is just like a giant ball of energy. She's just an amazing human being that does so much good for people in the community, and she's so positive. She's like the SE Village cheerleader. I mean, like she's so great about it too, and she makes people excited to want to try. And then she even teaches a class about how to compete in the SECTF for free. She puts on these classes on how to compete and how to make it through DEF CON and stuff like that. That kind of stuff is the stuff that we love to see and hear in the community. And Rachel's owning it.
Very cool. Yeah, she's been on the podcast too with us, so it was good to talk to her.
She's a great guest to have.
Yes, she loves David Lynch movies, so we had a good conversation about that. Awesome. Well, you can pick up Chris's book, which is right here,
Nice.
Which is excellent. You can pick it up on Amazon. I would assume that you could go to your local bookstore if those still exist near you, right?
Thank you.
And pick that up as well. But yeah, Chris, thank you very much for being a guest on the show again. Always a pleasure to talk to you. And of course, we'll have everything up in our show notes. And if you're watching this on YouTube, make sure you subscribe to our channel, and we'll talk to you next time.
Thanks.
Absolutely. Thanks, Chris.
Yeah. See you guys.